I had already told him no several times, a bunch of times over this 8-year period of time since when I was in junior high, 7th grade. I had attended this junior high getaway, they called it, at Ozark Christian College. And I remember the pastor who was preaching at that getaway. His name was Mark Scott. And at the end of his sermon, I don't remember what the sermon was about. I don't remember the theme of the weekend. But I remember at the end of that sermon, he said, some of you in the crowd, these group of junior hire, a couple hundred junior hires in that chapel. And he said, some of you in this room are being called right now into what he described as the full-time ministry. And he was describing the emotions that you maybe were experiencing. And he said, that's the Holy Spirit talking to you. And I thought, man, I'm kind of feeling that way. But there's no way that I'm walking to the front of the room in front of all of these people. There's no way that I am going to end up in what Mark Scott described as full-time ministry. So I remember gripping the armrests on that theater seat until my knuckles were sort of white and just remained seated over the next 8 years. I've told these stories before. My preacher in that little church would say at different times, Lance, have you ever thought about ministry? And every time I told him no. I just lied. No, I never thought about that. I'm not doing that. That's not what I want to do. I ended up at Bible college sort of with this bargain that I had struck in my own heart, in my own mind, I thought with God. I thought maybe God would leave me alone if I went to Manhattan Christian College and I could attend MCC and K-State and graduate in their dual degree program, and maybe that would satisfy God and I could still go do what I wanted to do. And so that's what I was doing. And as a sophomore in Bible college, that spring, that winter, over Christmas break, as I recall, that same senior pastor, we had weekend youth pastors from MCC that had led the youth ministry when I was growing up in that church. And over Christmas break, he said, Lance, I need somebody to come serve in youth ministry this summer. Why don't you do that? And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I've got plans this summer. Right? I want to, first of all, I want to have some fun this summer. And second of all, I need to earn some money this summer so I can go back to school. I've got stuff I want to do. And besides, I told him, I'm not going into ministry. You want somebody who is pursuing, that vocation. You want somebody who's going to be a youth pastor someday. You don't want me. And he said, no, I think I do. And so just think about it and pray about it. And to get out of the room, I lied to him again and said I would. And then I left, not praying about it, not thinking about it. And he just kept after me. Hey, would you do it this summer? Would you do it this summer? And as sort of my plan started to fall through, I thought, okay, I will do it this summer, I said. But then that's it. I'm out. I'm not doing it anymore. That would be 30 years ago this summer that I got joyfully stuck in ministry. We're studying a story of a guy who was called into ministry. And I'm not sure if he was reluctantly called or if he got joyfully stuck. But it reminded me as I thought about that my own call into ministry, and as I studied Nehemiah's call into ministry, it reminded me that we all share that same call. That no matter sort of, when we talk about what Mark Scott described as full-time ministry, we think of somebody who serves on, who's employed on a church staff. But Nehemiah reminds us that sort of no matter what our job is, we're all issued that same call to full-time ministry, where God is calling all of us to have a heart for ministry. And I think Nehemiah, and this story we're going to take a look at this morning in Nehemiah chapter 2, the first 8 verses, Nehemiah helps us to employ 3 strategies to sort of making sure, to trying to get our heart to beat with the heartbeat of God. For each one of us to have a heart for ministry. If you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to open them up to the book of Nehemiah. We're going to be in the 2nd chapter this morning. We're going to take a look at the first 8 verses here in Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. This is what God's word says. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing that you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." Then I was very much afraid. And I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, then you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me, to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy." And the king granted me what I asked for. The good hand of God was upon me. All right, 3 strategies that I think Nehemiah employs here that we can sort of copy, just like Sammy was talking about, that we can imitate, that we can employ as well, to have a heart for ministry. The first strategy is to step out of your comfort zone. We get to chapter 2 here of Nehemiah, and Nehemiah is right back to cupbearing. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. If you remember last week, we talked a little bit about what being a cupbearer means, and sort of the nuts and bolts of that position we see being played out here. When it was time for the king to eat, the cupbearer would taste the wine, and he'd taste the food to make sure, well, that it wasn't poisoned. And as long as the cupbearer lived, you gave that guy about 20 minutes, and if he lived, then you went ahead with the rest of the meal. And it also gave that cupbearer a close relationship. You had to trust this guy who was tasting your food and tasting your wine. It gave him a position of sort of influence with the king. And so as we see Nehemiah back at work, we're reminded, or I thought, we need to sort of remember a little bit what we know about Nehemiah so far. He's in this position, and scholars say we can probably know a few things about Nehemiah because of his position as cupbearer. These scholars say we can sort of assume, we can think that Nehemiah was probably a handsome guy. I suppose maybe they're thinking to the book of Daniel, and when those folks were carried off into captivity, the first couple chapters of Daniel tell us that they carried off and they put in these positions of influence the very best of the best, and they describe Daniel as being a handsome young man. And so maybe they just kind of employ that and put it across the board. And so they think, well, Nehemiah was probably a handsome guy. And Nehemiah was probably an intelligent guy. He served in this important position. And the king wouldn't want any just dummy serving in that role, right? So we can assume that Nehemiah was probably an intelligent guy. Nehemiah was a cultured guy. He knew about the sort of culture of the Persians and the political landscape, and so he had all of those things at his fingertips, and it was able to communicate those well. Nehemiah had this position of great influence with the king, and Nehemiah, as long as he didn't rock the boat, had really this this spot in life, this job in life that provided for him well, and that provided him with this really comfortable sort of place to be. As long as Nehemiah didn't rock the boat, then the king wasn't rocking the boat, and this handsome, intelligent, suave, sophisticated guy could just kind of keep going. In fact, scholars, the artists have come up with an artist rendering of what Nehemiah was likely to look like. I think we have a picture of that right here. And so Nehemiah, as long as he didn't rock the boat, you guys laughed a little too hard at that. As long as Nehemiah didn't rock the boat, he had this kind of comfortable life going on. And as we start to read chapter 2, that's what I'm reminded of here with Nehemiah. And so Nehemiah, he took up the wine and he gave it to the king, and he said, "Now I had not been sad in his presence." And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad?" If you go back, and if you're smarter than me and you can study the Hebrew well, then one of the things you'd learn there is that word sad, it could literally be translated as bad. It's sort of like if you've ever said to somebody, "Man, you look, tired today. You don't look well." And so that's sort of the conversation that's going on here in verse 2 when the king said, "Why do you look so sad when it's clear that you're not really sick? Why is your face sad, seeing that you are not sick?" This is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was very much afraid. And right between verse 2 and verse 3, the ESV leaves out one of my favorite words. The NIV and probably some other translations, but the NIV has this word, and it translates right between those two verses, this little word, "but." One of the most powerful words in all of Scripture. And I just wrote it in the ESV version here. I think it's that important. Right between those two verses. At the end of verse 2, he was very afraid. Verse 3, "But I said to the king," even though Nehemiah was afraid, even though he was worried about how this conversation would go, even though Nehemiah was very aware that as long as he didn't rock the boat, for 4 months, evidently, the months, if you remember, we get this weird month at the beginning of chapter 1, and we get this other weird month at the beginning of chapter 2, and the time period between those was about 4 months. For 4 months, Nehemiah had come into the presence of the king with a smile on his face. For 4 months, Nehemiah had kept going back to the king, and he'd not rocked the boat, but he got to a point where his heart was broken by the things that break the heart of God, to the point where he just I think, couldn't take it any longer. Some scholars say, well, maybe Nehemiah was waiting for just the right time. Maybe they say that what's being painted here in this setting is Nehemiah waiting for this great time of celebration, kind of this party that the king was having, so that the king would be in a good mood at the party, kind of like teenagers waiting for their parents to be in the right mood before asking if they can borrow the car. And maybe Nehemiah was sort of waiting for just the right time to bring it up. Nehemiah, even though he was afraid, even though he was unsure of how the king would respond, even though he was unsure of what the next step, I think, would be in this ministry process, even though Nehemiah was scared, he started this hard conversation with the king. "And I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's grave, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" And so Nehemiah lays out for the king, "This is why I look sad today. This is why my heart is broken." I just want you to start thinking this morning, what does it look like for us to step out of our comfort zone? For us to rock the boat in our relationship with God a little bit? I just bet that God has been whispering to some of us that I want you to take this next step. I want you to do this thing. I want you to try this for me. What does it look like to courageously step out of our comfort zone like Nehemiah did for ministry? There's so many opportunities here at Wallula Christian Church to serve in ministry. I just sent an email to some of our ministry team leaders and asked, what's your most urgent needs in ministry right now? And I got some responses, and I just printed out. It's corny because I'm corny, and I just put Wallula 1 ads at the top, right? And I just listed some of these responses from ministry team leaders. And there are things like in the children's ministry, Katie and her team need greeters as kids and families check in on Sunday mornings. They're looking for folks to serve in specific age groups in that kids ministry, or the worship team ministry needs folks to help with the tech ministry and in running slides as we sing on Sunday mornings, or helping to make sure the live stream goes out, and there's training available in all those positions. And the worship team, by the way, is always looking for folks who are talented and musicians and can play an instrument, and Craig would love to talk to you about those things. Or maybe hospitality ministry. Those are the folks who prepare the coffee on Sunday morning and make sure there's some goodies out for you when you walk in through the door, and they need folks who are willing to come out a little early on Sundays to help prepare that coffee and to put out those treats. Or the maintenance ministry, who's always looking for folks who can come out and help with some different sorts of repairs. And on campus, I promise you there is something broken right now that needs repaired. All right, and this last week was a good example. You just don't know when a 1.5 feet of snow is going to fall or whatever, and sidewalks need cleared, and ice needs scraped, and the maintenance team's looking for folks, maybe just with strong backs or even weak ones, to help come and help do some of those things. Third Thursday ministry feeds hundreds of people every third Thursday. They're looking for folks to help in that ministry. Our Shelter of Hope team needs folks to serve on Monday nights and Tuesday mornings, and those shifts, making sure people have a warm place to sleep every Monday night and Tuesday morning. The communion prep ministry, making sure those little cups are filled with bread and juice, and just things that sometimes we take for granted in our worship. Every week we show up and those cups are miraculously there. I promise you that it wasn't a miracle even this week, and somebody helped to fill and stack those and get those ready. And so there's a list of those things on the Next Step station, and grab that and take a look at them. And I just put at the bottom of that page, just contact me, and I'm going to get you in touch with the right person. Just for ease of doing that right now. But just think about, I know there's other things that God has been talking to you and that aren't on this list, and ways that He is asking you to step out of your comfort zone. Maybe it's something like taking that invitation card from your chair and finally talking to your neighbor about worshiping with you on Sunday morning, or inviting that coworker who you've been praying for and you know that they are in need of a relationship with Jesus, and it's just taking that last courageous step, that even though you are afraid, right? Even though you are scared, even though we don't know what the result will look like and how it will play out, even though all of that kind of anxiety is present, that was all present for Nehemiah. Oh, by the way, you think of other folks in Scripture. Do you suppose Moses, who had murdered this Egyptian, had escaped into the wilderness, had spent 40 years raising a family and shepherding sheep? Do you suppose when he meets God at that burning bush that he didn't feel a little bit anxious? Or Peter, as he sees Jesus walking across the water, and he said, "Is that really you?" And Jesus said, "It is." And then Peter said, "Well, if it's really you, let me come out." And Jesus said, "Okay, Peter, come on, step out of the boat." In that moment, don't you suppose Peter said, "Oh, I should have kept my mouth shut"? right? What was I thinking? As he was sort of overwhelmed by the sudden fear and anxiety of, this is the dumbest thing I've done, today. Moses eventually takes that step. Peter takes that step. Now, sometimes we're going to be in a spot like Peter where we're just going to need rescued by Jesus after that. We don't know what it's going to look like and how it's going to play out. I would just encourage you, somehow, some way, just take that courageous first step into ministry. Give it a try. Invite your neighbor to worship with you. Show up to that third Thursday spaghetti dinner. Sign up to fill some communion cups. Whatever it is, be a part of that small group for the first time. Take that courageous first step out of your comfort zone and into ministry. The second strategy that Nehemiah employs here and models for us is to ask God for help so you can help. Let's look at verse 4. Verse 4 says, "Then the king said to me, 'What are you requesting?' So I prayed to the God of heaven." What an amazing verse. What an amazing thing that Nehemiah does there. And I said to the king in verse 5, "If it pleases the king and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when you will return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. Now, some things are just interesting right away. Nehemiah is gone for 12 years. I doubt very seriously that he said, "Hey, I'm going to be gone for 12 years," right? In fact, lots of scholars think that in that initial year after the walls were built, Nehemiah probably reported back and kind of was commissioned to be governor of Judah for longer. Nehemiah, I think, sort of joyfully gets stuck in ministry. He doesn't start out saying, "Hey, I want to be serving in this over a decade in this role." But he kind of gets stuck in that spot. And he begins by asking God for help. One thing is so clear about Nehemiah in the book of Nehemiah. We are going to repeat ourselves over and over and over again all through this book. Last week we talked about that there are 9 prayers listed in 13 chapters. And here we don't get that prayer written out. It's just sort of this moment where Nehemiah pauses quickly. He said, "I prayed to the God of heaven." He's got to have this serious conversation. He's taken that initial step and he's ready to start. And now the king asks, "Well, what do you need?" And Nehemiah has to make this big ask. He's got to say, "I need to leave for a while and to rebuild these walls. And oh, by the way, we're going to get there. I need you to protect me as I travel, and I'm going to need some money and resources to make this happen." He's got a list of sort of needs and requests that he's about to make. And so before he jumps in to this conversation, he just stops and he prays to God. Or you go back to the very beginning of chapter 2, in just that 4-month period that we've already talked about. What was going on in those 4 months? Well, you backtrack a little bit and you realize that Nehemiah has been praying and fasting for 4 months. In fact, some scholars say that maybe one of the reasons that Nehemiah looked sad, that we said, well, that's really kind of, he looks tired, he looks bad, he doesn't look well. Well, maybe it's because he spent 4 months fasting and he's kind of just worn out from the whole thing. Nehemiah has spent those 4 months bringing these concerns before God. We learn from Nehemiah that there is this groundwork, this foundation in prayer that has been laid for ministry. And I think we learn a couple things about prayer here. And the first thing is, man, we need to consistently be praying sort of ahead of time. We've heard in the last several weeks, we've talked about this, just what does it look like to have a consistent time of prayer? A few weeks ago, Zach did a great job of talking about picking a place to pray and picking a time to pray and having a plan for our communion time, our quiet time with God. That prayer is both speaking to God and hearing from God through His Word, through His Spirit, through other believers. Have this consistent time of prayer. Nehemiah laid that groundwork. For 4 months, he was praying and fasting, spending time with God. I've been reading a bunch about prayer lately, sort of in preparation for the series and in these last couple of messages even. And to be honest, I've been frustrated with the many books I've read about prayer. There are so many books out there that you can read about prayer, but I've been searching and searching. I've sort of wanted, how do I communicate to people? How do I give folks maybe this step-by-step guide to how to get started in prayer? And admittedly, I've been a little frustrated because I've thought about my own prayer life and I thought, how do I communicate this? And what are steps 1, 2, and 3 as to how we're to pray? And I was reminded in one of these books, as I was sort of frustrated with my inability to find something to share with you folks, with this sort of step-to-step guide to how to pray, I was reminded by one of these books that when Jesus' disciples asked them, how do we pray? Teach us to pray. Do you know what Jesus did? He prayed. He just started praying. I remember I used to coach my son in playing baseball growing up, and I remember studying and looking up all these drills for teaching kids to pitch and to be able to pitch. And there are all these goofy drills and, throw a towel and do all these things. And I got to a place where, man, if you want somebody, an athlete, to get good at pitching, you know what they ought to do? They ought to pitch. And I sort of think the same thing is true in prayer. And in fact, I read one scholar, Richard Foster, who's an author and writes about these sorts of things. He said, by praying, we learn to pray. By praying, we learn to pray. One priest, monk kind of guy said that pray as you can, don't try to pray as you can't. In other words, just get started. Don't spend much time comparing yourself to how you think other people are praying. You are probably wrong, by the way. But don't worry about that. Don't think that, I need to spend this much time in prayer. It's a lot like any other activity. We've talked about this in different facets of spiritual discipline, but it's like if I was getting ready and I decided, I want to run a marathon. I haven't decided that, and I'm not going to. But if I did, I couldn't go out today or tomorrow and run 26 miles. Right? I'd have to start, running across the stage. That's about as far as I could go. Right? I'd have to train and develop the muscles and all the things necessary to be able to build up that kind of endurance. And I think this idea of pray as you can, don't pray as you can't, is don't get this idea that, if I was really spiritual, I'd be spending an hour or half an hour or whatever it is in your mind in prayer. 3 minutes every day spent in prayer is better than 13 minutes spent one day and then you're frustrated and you're out for a month. Right? Develop those muscles. Just start where you are and pray as you can. Prayer is simply talking to God and hearing from God. That's the process, I think, of sitting with His Word, spending time reading it and hearing from Him, and then talking to Him about what's going on in your life. Just share with Him what your day looked like yesterday, what your hopes and plans are for today. Ask Him what His plans are for your day. It's great to lift up kind of those hurts and joys in your life, the things going on with the important people around you. Spend time talking to Him about those things. Pray as you can, and don't worry about praying as you can't. Just get started and spend some time consistently talking with him. Lay that foundation. And that's what Nehemiah did. And then, oh, by the way, this is the example in Nehemiah's life that I want to imitate more and more in my own. Because Nehemiah gets to this situation and he stops and he prays in the moment and he asks God for direction. Man, I want to be better at that. Have you ever watched the movie, and the movie, is going on, and there's this fight on the airplane, and the pilot goes down, has a heart attack, or he's taken out by the bad guy, and so the hero has to step in and fly the plane, and he's never flown a plane, and what do? Well, they get on the communication, the radio, to the tower. In the tower, the pilot in the tower talks the guy down and he lands the plane safely, right? That's sort of praying in the moment. We're just seeking God's direction. We're just asking him, hey, talk me down, right? Help me land this plane. And so in the moment, be willing to stop and talk with God. This last week, I've been trying to do this in just some simple ways. I just decided this last week that, hey, if I was in the store just yesterday picking up some things at the store and I was waiting in line to check out, and I decided while I'm doing that, while I'm waiting in line this week, I'm going to pray for the people in front of me. It's amazing how your attitude changes, by the way. When you're praying for folks in front of you, instead of thinking, I think they have 27 items in this 24 item or less line, what in the world is wrong with this person, right? Just spending that time waiting in line, praying for the folks in front of me, it brings up all kinds of things you can talk to God about as you just kind of watch folks check out in front of you and pray for them. Just a small way in the moment to be talking to God, to ask God for help so that you can help. That's the second strategy. The third strategy is don't do anything alone. Verses 7 and 8 say, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me, to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and the letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of God was upon me. And I just think as I read those two verses that we learn a couple things about Nehemiah's expectation for ministry. First thing I think we learn is that Nehemiah didn't expect it to be easy. Right? He literally asks the king for protection. He expects for there to be opposition. He anticipates that, and he's asking for help in that regard. And then he knows that he won't be able to do it alone. And so he's asking for resources. I need timber. I'm going to need money. I need this help from you, king. And oh, by the way, at the very end of verse 8 is another theme, another characteristic of Nehemiah that we'll come back to over and over in the book of Nehemiah as we work our way through this. He is very acutely aware that none of this is possible without God. That, yeah, he needs the help of the king. He's going to need the help of this Asaph fellow with all the trees. He's going to need help from lots of other people as he gets more into this process. But absolutely and without a doubt, he requires the help of the God in heaven, and he seeks it over and over and over again. And he knows that I need to help, and he just understands, he employs this third strategy to not do anything alone. I used to talk to youth coaches all the time in youth ministry. That youth ministry was all about building relationships, and this is true in ministry. This is true just in life. And so this simple strategy helps us to do that. Just don't do anything alone. That means we used to say things like, hey, if you're going to watch the football game, you're watching the Chiefs yesterday, and you have a little chili or a hot dog, don't have that hot dog alone. Invite a kid over to watch that game with you. When you're raking leaves in the front yard, man, invite that knucklehead teenager over to help you rake some leaves with you. Don't do anything alone. And as you take that first step into ministry here at Wallula Christian Church, we don't want you to do that alone. If you're heading out and taking that step into ministry alone, you're kind of doing it wrong. We want you to work alongside and work alongside and serve alongside other people in ministry. It's the example that Nehemiah sets here in the book of Nehemiah. It's the example, by the way, that Jesus sets for us. He walked around for 3 years with these 12 other guys. And when he sent those folks out to serve in ministry, he didn't send them out alone. He said, man, you go with somebody else and you serve alongside somebody else. Whatever it is, don't do it alone. Serve and work with somebody out. Nehemiah lived this out. He just worked hard, and he used this acronym that I learned this last week when our staff was at Manhattan Christian College, and so I've adapted it just a little bit. I like it because it spells the word pie, and so that encourages me. But he prayerfully planned for the ministry ahead and who to involve in that. He asked God for help first, and then he said, I know I'm going to need help. And so he prayerfully planned for that ministry and thinking about who could be involved. And then he identified those folks, the talents and the skills and the personality necessary for the task, and then he encouraged and asked for help in those ministries. And so we can do the same thing. If you're leading a ministry right now, prayerfully plan for who might be involved. Identify those folks and with the resources and the skills that they have to help, and then encourage them along the way. If you're thinking, man, I need to take this step and I'm not sure where to start, maybe grab one of those Wallula Want ads at the next step station. In just several weeks and next month, we'll have the next Explore Wallula. At our Explore Wallula, we will resource you with a spiritual gift assessment. And if you've never served in ministry and you're asking, what does that look like and how has God shaped me for ministry, that's a starting place for you to start to figure that out in prayer and relationship with Him. Come to that Explore Wallula class. Get one of those spiritual gift assessments. Get started. Take that step, that courageous step into ministry for the first time. Get started today. Don't do anything alone. I think about that first step into ministry, and I remember leaving student ministry after a decade in student ministry and coming to Wallula and serving in a preaching ministry for the first time. And I announced that to my students. I was leaving in that ministry and youth coaches, and they did something that I still laugh about today, and I still have in my closet some of these because they decided, hey, you're going to be a preacher, and you got this real job finally, and so now they said you're going to have to wear ties every Sunday. And so on my last Sunday at that church, they gave me all of these neckties, and they were the ugliest they did that on purpose, They found the ugliest, oldest looking neckties they could find, and they said, good luck in this next ministry, and they handed me all these neckties, and I have a few of those still hanging in my closet to remind me of that. Now, you maybe have noticed we don't wear a lot of neckties around Wallula, and they were just wrong about this. And I thought they were just being funny, and they were encouraging in their own offbeat way. But I just look at those neckties, and I just remember that, hey, you maybe are sitting there thinking, like I have through the years, that you don't look like other people serving in ministry. When you look at folks serving in that kid's ministry, you think, man, I don't look like the rest of them. God's saying maybe I ought to be leading that 4th and 5th grade Sunday school class, but I don't look like the other folks serving in kids ministry or on the worship team or whatever it is. I've thought the same thing through the years. My personality doesn't look like these other folks. You know, you don't look the same. You don't act the same. You don't have to dress the part to be able to serve God well. Don't let that discourage you. Employ these strategies. Take that courageous first step. Ask God for help so that you can help. And then just serve on a team. Don't do it alone. Have a heart for ministry. Let's stand and worship Him right now.